off the interview with just to ask you a little bit. Prior to being the Dean of Libraries at the University of Florida, you were the first female to serve as the Superintendent of Documents for the GPO, and that really is a kind of a major achievement. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and how it's impacted your career.
Well, it's definitely had a significant impact on my career. It was a wonderful position. Bruce James came in as the public printer and recruited me to come in as his Superintendent of Documents. And he was a really transformational leader. Came into an organization that was probably still operating in kind of the 1950s, and started consulting with them about how the agency should be run and trying to get them to engage in strategic planning, and was often getting responses back like, just tell us what you want us to do. You know, they just were not used to being consulted, to being engaged. Did a lot of change management programming with the senior managers to kind of bring people along, but he was himself an entrepreneur and had such interesting ideas and was so open to innovation and to trying new things and unafraid of risk. And so it was really, I can't imagine that I would have wanted to work there in the historic GPO as Superintendent of Documents, but it was a really wonderful experience to be there with him. It was a time of kind of continuing change in the depository library program in particular, but really culminating in some ways with some really major decisions about the movement into digital content and that kind of thing. And there was a lot of resistance in the program. So I think one of the things I learned was how difficult it can be to manage change, and how to work with people with very much opposing points of view, or at least different points of view, and to try to still move things forward as much as we could. When I was asked to apply to the job at the University of Florida, I have to say I was surprised. I was like, it never even occurred to me to aspire to be a dean of an ARL, a research library. But after I came and interviewed, I thought, oh, I really want this job. This is going to be a really interesting job. And I have really loved every minute of it. I mean, UF is an amazing place to work, and we've just been able to do a lot of interesting things, even though we've weathered the recession together and all. And I do think a lot of what happened at GPO really prepared me. It's a very different kind of a bureaucracy, but you're going from a government bureaucracy into an academic bureaucracy. If anything, I found the academic one actually easier to navigate.
I was going to say, that experience must have helped you navigate the bureaucracy at the University of Florida.
Yeah, it really did. But I think one of the reasons that I appealed to them as a candidate was the sense that I had this experience of managing change. And one of the things I heard later that the president of the university told the deans when he told them I'd accepted the job was that I was a diversity candidate, not because I was a woman, but because I had worked in government and industry. And in academia, we run the risk of only talking to people like ourselves, and that occasionally we need to talk to people with other points of view. And I thought, wow, what a really nice way for him to position me with them. You know, and they were incredibly welcoming when I came, and have remained, you know, very good colleagues, and it's really been an interesting experience.
Well, you know, you recently initiated what some say was a controversial pilot project between the University of Florida and Elsevier that shows that how publishers and universities can work together to make their platforms and repositories interoperable. Can you describe that project? I mean, where did the idea come from?
Well, the idea actually originated with a number of conversations I had over a period of time with my provost and my vice president of research and over the years, different heads of the Faculty Senate Research Council. And even before the OSTP policy passed and we knew that we were going to get involved in compliance with federal funder mandates, there was a real interest in knowing more about what our faculty published and in highlighting the contributions that we were making to scholarship. And every time these conversations came up about, well, the faculty could notify us, they could put things in the IR, the answer that came back, phrased slightly differently from each one, but essentially the bottom line was, why can't the library solve this problem without, the word might be annoying or bothering, or you could find different synonyms, but our very busy faculty, right? Do not put a burden on our faculty.
Right.
And I would respond like to the Research Council of, well, if you don't tell me what you published and you don't tell me what rights you retained or signed away, it's very difficult for me to do this for you, right? I need to know.
Right.
And I thought about it for a while, and the fact that they kept saying to me that I should solve this problem. And how did they think I'm going to do that? And I eventually approached Elsevier. I had been invited to serve on the North American Library Leadership Board of Elsevier, which is a small group of primarily research libraries, but represented a number of libraries. I wasn't quite sure why I was there, but since I was, I had met a number of people, including Alicia Weiss, who does their open access publishing. And I went to Alicia and said, okay, so I've been thinking about this, and I know that our people publish a lot of articles with Elsevier, and you've got the manuscripts, and you know what permissions they gave. So couldn't I get that from you in one place, rather than chasing all these authors around the campus? And we immediately started kind of discussing how would that work, what would we do, and it came out fairly quickly after that that Elsevier had begun developing APIs, application program interfaces, that would facilitate the identification and downloading of metadata related to articles by our authors into our IR, and then when those showed up in the search results, linking back out to the Science Direct platform and allowing people to access the published article. And interestingly, my staff immediately said, that's what our authors want. They want us to be showcasing their published article. They want the usage statistics on the platform, so they come back on the impact when they go up for tenure and promotion. They would rather that people were citing and using the finished article, even though there might be only minimal changes from the manuscript.
Right.
They wanted that usage that way. So we started down the path of doing that. At the time, one of the things Elsevier did for me was they pulled together what I call a bubble chart. And it's in the collaborative librarianship article. I've used it a number of places. But it had a bubble in a different color for each of the major families of publishers, and some statistics about the impact factors of citations of UF authors and things. And what it showed us was that our authors were generating about 8,000 articles a year, and 1,100 to 1,300 of those were in Elsevier. So if you looked at the bubbles, the biggest bubble was the Elsevier bubble, and then there's a drop down, and then there's Wiley and Springer that were pretty comparable, and then a drop down and a range of others, just even looking at the top 10 or so families of publishers. So it was very logical to start with Elsevier. They were willing. They were already themselves thinking about how could they provide this kind of a service to their users, and they wanted somebody to test it with them. And it seemed to me if I could deal with that high a percentage of the articles from my authors, it was a good place to begin. So,
what was the initial reaction from the faculty? Did they buy into this?
Well, it really, I have presented it a couple of times to the faculty. Most of the discussion of it has been with the Research Council and the Provost and the Vice President of Research, and they've been very receptive to it. I mean, they saw that this would give all of them information without placing a burden on the faculty.
Right.
We're a Vivo campus, and so we haven't gotten that far, but one of the things we looked at was we should be able to export this metadata into people's Vivo profiles, so we could say to them eventually, if you publish in an Elsevier journal, we'll populate your citations into your Vivo profile. Similarly, we've started an online tenure and promotion system. We could populate it into that. As we began to think about compliance, we knew that the Office of Compliance in the Division of Sponsored Research was going to have a significant burden with the OSTP policy, and that there would have to be programming done to make use of this, but just the fact that they knew that Professor Jones or Professor Smith had published an article would put them one leg up.
Right.
And actually, it's evolving now into another project which will actually give us information about whether not only they've published, but that they've actually deposited it in the appropriate agency repository.
What was your greatest challenge in all this?
I think you'll find this funny. The greatest challenge was figuring out who were UF authors. So think about it. We're not Clemson, we're not Stanford. We don't have a unique name. We have the words university and Florida. And not only are there lots of different ways to abbreviate that, FL, FLA, Florida, UNIV with and without a period. I mean, you could go on. I think we found 35 or 40 different ways the name had been used over time. And then, of course, there is the University of Central Florida, the University of West Florida, the University of South Florida. So getting out the false drops. So that really was the hardest thing. The rest was relatively easy. We do have our own platform, SOBEC, which we developed in-house and is used by a number of other institutions, but heavily by Florida and some of our partners in digital projects. And so they were interested in testing it. It was a new API, so there was some workarounds back and forth and some feedback. They wanted us to help them evaluate how clear and simple their instructions were and were there changes that needed to be made. And of course, we needed to ingest the information and then figure out how it was going to display in our search results. So we had some of those, but those were really routine.
Pretty straightforward.
The hardest part was trying to figure out. I've always been a strong advocate of ORCID. I've become a very strong advocate of Ringgold or Rheingold. I've heard it. Ringgold. Because if we had a code in there that identified them as UF authors, it would be way easier.
Oh, gotcha.
But one of the interesting things we discovered, which was a surprise to us, was in the Elsevier articles published between 2009 and the first quarter of 2016, we found, might not get the number right, but it's going to be roughly something like 640 open access articles in Elsevier journals representing 1,443 authors. So our authors are doing an amazing amount of open access publishing in Elsevier. So we've analyzed it now to see what colleges and institutes it's coming from. We're going to do a survey of them to find out more about what was their motivation, what was their source of funding, presumably grants, but we don't really know that. We had one author who had published over 30 open access articles in Elsevier in that time frame. Several others who'd published well over 20, number in the dozens, and then of course a lot in the kind of 1 to 6 or 1 to 8 kind of range. But that was the most surprising finding. Our VP of research didn't realize that was that much open access publishing happening. So we're really interested now in doing further research on that, but also extending the analysis deeper to understand better what's happening and why.
It's interesting that there's that much open access.
I know. I thought it was. I mean, I don't think again, we didn't really have, we knew people publishing in PLOS and Biomed Central. We were quite aware of that, but we hadn't previously tried to look at it specifically from Elsevier. It was sort of a side effect because we were flagging all the open access articles because we wanted every article in the search results that was an open access article to be clearly labeled as such, not just for people to know that they had access to it, but to know they had access because it was an open access article. And so the programmer who was working with us on implementing our APIs was able to give me that statistic and then ultimately to pull the data for us about who those authors were and where they came from.
It also seems that one of the benefits would be increasing the visibility of the work of the University of Florida researchers.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, has that happened, and has there been increased use of University of Florida researcher articles, produced articles? Can you tell?
We've really only been operating the pilot, finishing the phase 1 part of the pilot a few months ago, and I haven't really looked at the stats yet very much. I think what we do see happening is that if somebody is searching in the IR, whether they've come there through Google or they've come there deliberately, if somebody's put in a conference paper or a white paper or any other, their thesis or dissertation, and you search on that topic, you're going to see not just their internal documents, you're going to see these published documents as well integrated into the search results. And we think that will be, in the end, something that's very helpful. And the way it's been implemented, they can leave the search results and go to the Elsevier platform and look at a published article, but then they can come back to the platform and go and look at a thesis or go and look at a conference paper. And so we think that will, in the end, help them look more holistically at the work of that author, or even at the work on that subject matter within the University of Florida.
Also seems that it would enhance the value of the repository.
Yes, it does, I think, a lot. And we did not have a culture of deposit at the University of Florida. We had 7 Elsevier articles in the IR when we started the project, and they were all open access articles that had been published during the brief period of time when we had an open access publishing fund, and one of the requirements was if we funded you to publish, you had to deposit your article. So there's not a culture there. I know some universities, there's a a really strong effort to collect those things from the faculty and maybe a strong compliance on the part of the faculty, but that has not been part of our culture.
Right.
And as I say, instead it was this, can't you do this without burdening our faculty? So this doesn't burden our faculty, and it potentially gives us an opportunity to do more for them and to
almost
be an
like
asset rather than a burden.
I was going to say, almost like a painless way of
Yes.
getting them to buy into
Exactly.
depositing into the
Because then they'll
repository.
get reports every month. They get reports now that your conference paper or your
Right.
thesis was viewed X times. They'll get reports every month that say, and your Elsevier paper was also viewed. So they'll know their paper is there. They'll get some direct benefit from that. They can link to it, which they can do anyway with the DOI, but you know, it's just an easy thing for them to do.
As a person who gets those reports, I'm always like, gee, I wish they just bought a book. But it's not, I'm still happy.
Happy to know somebody's reading it.
Yes,
You've gone to the
absolutely.
effort of writing it.
Yeah.
It's really nice to know that somebody found it and read it. right?
Absolutely.
So,
And found it useful. That's,
yes, exactly.
You know, I was wondering about the increased visibility of the articles the University of Florida researchers published in Elsevier. Are you exploring similar sorts of arrangements with other publishers?
Yes, so several years ago, I was at an SSP, Society of Scholarly Publishing meeting, and there was a whole panel on chorus. And they had somebody from OSTP and somebody from SHARE, the AAU, APLU, ARL project, and Howard Ratner from chorus, and I think somebody else on the panel. And I went up to Howard afterwards because he had this really interesting slide up with the word compliance in red, circled in the middle. And he had figures representing, I think I can do it right, funding agencies, publishers, the public, librarians, and researchers. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, Howard, the person on my campus who is losing sleep over that word compliance is not on your slide. It's the vice president of research. He's the one who is worrying, and he and I had been having these conversations about as compliance becomes mandatory, the risks of having non-compliant authors become substantial. And Howard did subsequently amend his slide and add the VP of Research. But I also said to him, look at this slide, setting aside John Q. Public, and we do all understand the desire to serve him or her. You're developing chorus to serve the publishers and the funding agencies. And there's 3 of us now that you've added the VP of Research along the bottom of the slide, and we all come from academia. And it's a 3-legged stool, and you're planning on 2 legs. So you need us there because it's not going to help you to develop chorus so it meets the needs of the funding agencies and the publishers if it doesn't meet our needs.
Right.
And so I said, I really understand why you have to start with the funding agencies, and it has to work for the publishers and the funding agencies. But at the time that you're ready, you should come and talk to me and to other people in academia, and let's build it as a 3-legged stool. And so I ran into Howard various places over the following year or so. And every time I saw him, I sort of said, hey, ready to call me yet? So, it was sort of a friendly, kind of thing, but just not letting him forget. And a couple of months ago, he called me and he said, we're ready. And I was like, really? I thought we were going to do the Chinese water torture for much longer. So at any rate, he's got 7 publishers who are members of Chorus who have been observing the Elsevier project. One of them is Elsevier. Elsevier Wiley, I don't want to name them and get them wrong, American Chemical Society, American Institute of Physics, Rockefeller University Press. I'm not remembering them all. I have a slide I could share with you. But anyway, that had been listening to Elsevier make presentations at the Chorus board meetings for several years or several periods of time about our project, and they were like, oh, we could do this. So we're doing starting a project. They're going to do something a little different. They're developing a dashboard. They're going to gather information about publications by UF authors. They're going to look at the metadata and see, okay, this one was funded by the Department of Energy. I can see the grant information in the metadata. Then they're going to take that metadata and they're going to match it to the DOE repository. And then when they report it to us through the dashboard, it'll say, Dr. Smith published this article, it was funded by DOE, and the article is in the repository. Dr. Jones published this article with NSF, and it's not yet in the repository. And I'm going to be able to feed that information over to the Office of Compliance, and they're going to be able to know that the articles have been published and match them to the funding agency and to the grant. And they're going to know which ones are already compliant that they don't have to worry about, and they're going to know who they have to chase to get compliance. And when we get the report the next month, maybe by then Dr. Smith has complied.
Right.
But they're ecstatic about the idea that this will really help them. And they've already said at some of the academic deans meetings that the deans and the department chairs are responsible for the compliance of the people in their departments. This will funnel to them, Dean X, the person in this department hasn't yet complied, but it's not, here's everybody who published, go figure out if they complied. So I think that's going to be very useful. I really feel like we're doing an enormous service. It's going to get complicated because sometimes the funding's from more than one source.
Right.
And they have different requirements about where things go and when and how. But I'm very encouraged by the openness, and they believe that before this finishes that more of the chorus publishers will join it. So, my greatest wish would be that I could get 80, 85, 90% of the UF articles identified from one source, and then all we have to chase is the remaining 10% who may be in more unusual publications or more remote things to identify. So.
I think you've partially answered my next question, and it strikes me that this arrangement you've developed could serve as a model for other libraries
Absolutely.
and other publishers.
And that is our hope.
And I'm wondering, it sounds like this chorus arrangement is starting to go in that direction.
Right.
Is there any other evidence? Have you
Yes.
had
So
inquiries? Go ahead.
I've been working with them to have conversations with other institutions to recruit them to participate. And I've been talking with the deans. I've also put some of my implementation staff on the phone with them, so they are talking peer to peer at the level of the people in their organizations who would actually have to do the work, not just talk about it. And we have a couple of other institutions, one of whom just signed their paperwork, but I don't think they made the public announcement yet, and a couple of others who are in the pipeline. We really felt, I felt, that I can't be a voice for every academic institution. I can certainly represent the University of Florida, and I can try to be to generalize from that about what other people may need, but having a couple of institutions of different sizes, some private, some public, some larger, some smaller, is going to be really important to understanding that this third leg of the stool will actually stand on level ground and serve multiple users. So we are hoping that we'll pick up at least 3 to 5 in this pilot, and then that it would expand outward from there. I think we've all been looking since the OSTP policy passed at what new unfunded mandate was that policy putting on the publishers, on the funding agencies, and on us. And looking at what were we going to have to do at our own institutions to manage compliance. And so this seems like a really good partnership to get a leg up on at least part of that effort, of at least having information that will be helpful to the Office of Research. So,
I noticed in your presentation you focused on another major interest of yours, which is collaborative collection development. You discussed a number of major initiatives in this area. Can you talk about them, or
yeah, I don't know.
which ones were really effective?
Wow, so probably the one of the ones that's longest standing is the Digital Library of the Caribbean, DLOC as we call it. That had already started. I came in '07. It was already a couple of years old, and it's 11 years old now. It has now grown, so it's 43 partners, mostly libraries, archives, and other kinds of collections in Caribbean countries, some in the U.S., a couple in Europe, primarily from the colonial powers who have good archives about their former colonial territories. It's a really interesting collaboration because each institution has its own presence on the platform that they can host through their own website, so that you are just looking at the things that have been contributed by that library, that archive. So we've helped them build out their own presence, but they're also cross-searchable. It's very challenging because everybody's deciding what's important to them to contribute. They have their own metadata schema, their own everything. And we have, see if I can do this, we have English, Spanish, French, Dutch, Creole, Haitian Creole, Papiamentu, and Hebrew language materials that have been submitted.
Wow.
There may be missing, but those are the major ones. So it's multilingual. It's been a really very interesting collaboration, and we've built really strong friendships and partnerships, and in the beginning days, a lot of the training was coming from the U.S. to them, and in fact, in the early grant we were able to help them get equipment as well as training for some of them, but they're now training other people in the Caribbean and cross-training back to us, and so it's just been wonderful to watch the growth of this and the pride that they take in it. One of the Haitian groups has developed now an award-winning part of the platform that's called Haiti and Island Luminous. You can just Google it. It's a breathtaking digital scholarship project. So this isn't just a bowl of content. It's leading to these really vibrant digital scholarship projects. We have a couple of academic courses that have grown out of using some of the DLOC content. We've got a board of scholars who's working with us. It's a pretty amazing opportunity. And then, interestingly, out of that, several other partnerships have grown. So after the Haitian earthquake, a group of primarily academic, but a Law Library of Congress, a couple of other research law libraries, were interested in building a comprehensive collection of Haitian law to give back to the people of Haiti because they had lost a lot of their resources, but also for scholars of Haiti, so it would serve dual purpose. And I happened to have lunch with the guy from the Law Library Microfilm Consortium, as it used to be called, who was planning it, and he was telling me about it, and he was all excited about it, and I said, well, why haven't you talked to me? And he was like, well, your law library doesn't collect in this. And I'm like, I'm not talking about the law library, I'm talking about my Latin American and Caribbean collection, which does collect. And he said, oh, I never thought about that. It was a law library project, and we all do our silos. And he went back and started looking at our collection, and we became the third largest contributor, even though the project was well along at that point. And LLMC's platform was a membership platform, so it didn't have public access, and the whole point was to give it to the people of Haiti as well.
Right.
And so DLOC became the public access platform, and that collection is among the 10 most heavily used collections in DLOC and among the 10 most heavily foreign language collections in LLMC. And so now they looked at that and said, wow, this was fun, this was a great model. We got, I think, 15 or more libraries collaborating in building this collection. We want to do it for Cuba, and we'll start with the University of Florida collection, and we've finished ours, we've given them all of our stuff, and we've helped recruit other people, and they're now reaching out to other libraries and building it out. So there's already a presence for the Cuban Law Initiative on DLOC and in LLMC. And we have a partnership with the Bibliothèque Nationale José Martí, the National Library of Cuba. They joined DLOC about 3 years ago and started putting their content into DLOC, much the way these other libraries and archives have done. They've had visits back and forth with us and recently signed an agreement that we're going to work with them to try to digitize as comprehensive as possible a set of Cuban heritage content from 1900 back. He's done this analysis of his own collection. He's digitized 89,000 cataloging records, and he's had his staff analyze it, and they believe that 58% of those materials represented by those cards, and of course a card can represent large sets in some cases, that 58% of those are uniquely held in Cuba. And so he has to do those. There's no other way they're going to get done. But what he's asked us to do is, can we build partners who will work on the other 42%, where at least one of us has got it outside of Cuba. And the idea would be we would exchange content with him and he with us. It would all be on DLOC for public access. And he would also host it in country. They have relatively limited internet access. I'm sure that will change. But at the moment, he can't do the public access himself because he doesn't have the internet capability to do it. So, I mean, it's DLOC to Haitian law to Cuban law to Cuban heritage. I mean, it's just this beautiful continuum.
Yeah.
And part of it is, you build a relationship with somebody working on one project, and then they trust you, and and they're comfortable with taking a risk to do another one, and it just builds. It's a really, and my staff has just been amazing about this. I mean, they love DLOC, they love these projects. They're so engaged with their counterparts in these other countries. It's been a fabulous project, and I'd love to see that as a model. It just seems like you should be able to pick that up geographically and do it in other places, although, of course, as difficult as it is to move around the Caribbean in as many different languages and things as we have, it's still contiguous. I mean, it's still a fairly small area if you think of trying to do this in Africa, for instance.
Right.
But still, the model is a really interesting...
The potential is there.
Potential is there.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting model.
I would wonder about the financial resources of smaller libraries,
Yeah.
enabling them to participate in these kind of sophisticated projects.
Right.
Have you found that to be a stumbling
So
block?
it's been, that's also been a very interesting part of this project. So we initially had a TICFIA grant from the Department of Ed, and we had a 4-year grant, and that allowed us to do some of the initial training and recruit some of the initial members, and do some travel and bring them up for training and those kinds of things. And then we got a renewal, and which was to be a second 4-year grant. And 2 years into it, in the recession, they canceled the second 2 years. So we had already begun planning for the idea that at the end of the second grant, we would have to be self-sustaining and looking at how was that going to work. But then we had to abruptly become self-sustaining. And what ultimately worked out was setting a sort of a stratified or tiered due structure, where those of us who could contributed more. But that had to be done with great deference and care, not to try to create a we-they situation, not to create any implication that these partners were less valuable, but rather to acknowledge that the value of the content they were bringing and the expertise they were bringing was sufficient, that we were willing and able to deal with some of the financial. And so it's worked out really well. It's the membership has grown in this time, even with the self-funding. So I think we've made that transition successfully. We had a number by then, because we were already 6 years into it and had a lot of goodwill and positive experience. We were able to have leadership from the Caribbean libraries and archives, so that it didn't seem like it was something that the U.S. was doing to or for them, but rather that we were doing it together.
It was a partnership.
It was a partnership already. So would it have been nice not to have it end so abruptly? Oh yeah, but we really, and in some ways the pressure and everybody looking at it and saying, oh, we don't want to lose this, really rallied everybody to looking at how would we do this. So I think we've really made a successful transition. I don't know how much time you have and whether you want to talk about another one of them, but you asked about the GPO experience. One of the things that I got into as soon as I got to Florida was the Collaborative Federal Depository Library Program from ACERL. Are you familiar with that one at all?
I've heard of it.
So several regional documents librarians in the Southeast had put in an IMLS grant to look at whether there could be increased collaboration. And the IMLS grant was already underway, and they had already started doing some things together when I came, and they invited me to join the committee, steering committee, which I gladly did, and immediately said, well, the University of Florida needs to have one of these centers of excellence, which they were beginning to create, like to look within their collections of where were their collecting strengths. And so we joined immediately, not only me personally, but we created our own center of excellence around Panama and the Canal, because we had a major collection and we're in the process of expanding that collection. And then the deans began to pay attention to it, and we had a meeting of the deans, and they all agreed that the depository collections were important, but there were real difficulties about the administration of them, and empowered us to try to develop guidelines that would be uniform throughout the Southeast. So one of the big burdens of the depository program, and I had tried to solve these problems from within GPO, so it was sort of funny to be solving them from outside, more easily and successfully, I might add. Although it's a lot easier to herd 12 regional depositories in 10 states than 49 regional depositories in, So, but we ended up, the way it worked, each regional had their own disposition rules. So if you were under one regional and you had things you wanted to discard from your collection, they would tell you had to do it this way. And if you were under a different regional, they'd tell you to do that way. And so the first thing we did was we simplified it. And we said we all have to agree and we all have to have the same discard rules, so that it doesn't matter if you're in Alabama or Mississippi or Florida or Kentucky, we're all the same. And we got 12 depositories, regionals, to agree, and their deans. The deans made a big difference, not because they were down in the weeds enough to know how to settle it out, but because they empowered them to act and to act boldly. And then we had other selectives from these different states participating to say, these are the problems we're having, these are what we need you to solve. And then we were able to take on at UF, writing a program to automate the disposition process, because the rules were common. So it's pretty easy to write a program to help you list your offers, things you want to discard, and for me to list my needs if it isn't going to be a different set of rules when I get to his library, So we have now, I want to say 38 libraries in the region who have created one or more centers of excellence around either a topic or an agency. So Ole Miss has a really amazing special collection that's the archives of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. So when they were looking at what collection within government documents would really make sense for them and be of high value, they chose the IRS, because the two things together each made the other collection more valuable. My colleague at Florida International University was already running the Digital Library of the Everglades. Understandable, she's in Miami, right? So she decided that she wanted to take a subject approach, and that if they were going to try to have this comprehensive digital collection about the Everglades, they should have a comprehensive print collection about the Everglades. So she took a subject approach. I don't care what agency publishes it, we're going to try to get a copy of every document that's associated with the Everglades. And she's a selective, so she's not even a regional, but nevertheless that collection was going to mean something to her and to her constituents. UF has taken on a fairly large number. I think we have over 35, but most of them are really small agencies, and a lot of them are defunct agencies. It's a lot easier to do a defunct agency because they're not continuing to publish. And some of that came about because we already had 300,000 pre-1976 government documents in storage, and a lot of them were these small ag units. And we had already committed to cataloging them. It's one of the commitments you made as a Center of Excellence is that you would catalog, and that you would seek to fill in the blanks in your collection. You'd seek to make the collection comprehensive. So we've done the National Commission on Libraries and the Office of Technology Assessment, both of which are places Judy worked, so you can understand maybe why those got selected. And the big collection we took on was congressional hearings, and that is a mammoth collection, and we're still cataloging our congressional hearings. But that's been a really interesting project. We had some pushing and shoving with GPO, maybe you'd say. We had some back and forth with GPO to get agreement that they would allow to do it. My instruction from my deans, my fellow deans, was to take this as far as I could, but not violate Title 44. So we sort of defined that as, if the law tells us to do something, we're going to do it. But if tradition or GPO regulation or any other thing tells us to do it, we may or may not feel obligated to do that. And so we did feel that we crafted a program which has worked really well. We're seeing a fairly steady exchange of publications among all the states. So it's not just like I just show to the people in my region, you know, what is being discarded in our region. I'm showing it to all 10 states and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which report through me. So things are moving around. They're not just, if you don't get it used in Florida, it gets tossed out. It can go to Georgia, it can go to Kentucky. So it's been a really interesting
That's fascinating.
model. Yeah, we were really pleased. And you know, it did help that I had been at GPO and had spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make it better.
Right.
And I understood what the law actually required as distinct from tradition, and you know, so.
Now, these are regional efforts.
Yep.
Do you see a future where we would have a national effort to encourage this kind of collaborative
So
collection development?
we've also been involved in several shared print projects. And so we set up one really immediately when I arrived in Florida called the Florida Academic Repository, which was looking at a collection for the state university system of shared print. And then simultaneously, ASERL, the Southeast Research Libraries, were working on a shared print project for the region, for the whole set. And we wanted FLAIR and ASERL to be complementary. So every journal that was recorded in FLAIR is also recorded in ASERL. So I did the same thing there. Out of self-interest, I developed the software so I wouldn't have to put reports in two different pieces of software for two different collections. There have been other print journal initiatives that have been going on in other parts of the country, and we started last year meeting together. So the West group, the CIC group, that's the now Big Ten Plus, and at some point ASERL merged with the Washington Regional Library Consortia, so we have Scholars Trust is the new name for that. So we now have these 4 or 5 consortia that are all looking at, we're the ones who are at the moment the biggest of the ones who are doing journals. You know, what can we do together? So I think it's so much easier to start these locally and regionally. I mean, the geography does make a difference. It makes a difference in the trust. If I'm going to rely on the fact that you have a journal that my people might need, it's a little harder to say to them, well, they'll send it from California. than to say they're going to send it from Georgia. You know, it's not insurmountable in this day and age with overnight shipping and digitization and other things, but the psychology of it, and then the fact that we're otherwise meeting together on a regular basis, so we've got personal relationships and, of trust and things. But now we're at a point where each of those groups is beginning to look at, can we harmonize what we're doing, can we share information? So not only is Scholars Trust and Flair using this journal software that we developed, but West is using it as well, and we're looking to see whether others want to do it. And it built on the depository thing, because one of the interesting things required by law in the depository program was this needs and offers business. But the guy who had done the programming for that did the programming for journal, and he was like, well, you guys are going to have needs and offers. You're going to have journal sets that are incomplete, and you're going to want to disclose what's missing. And if you're weeding and you're throwing away that journal based on the fact that I have it, but you have some of the volumes I'm missing, so it's got a needs and offers function built in, which was part of what brought the West group, and they had other software that was managing other parts of their archiving, but they were very interested in participating in the idea that we could each help each other fill in the gaps.
This is really encouraging to hear all this, you know, cooperation.
Yeah.
It's really something. Jack, did you have any other questions?
No.
I did want to, in the interest of not missing anything, I was going to ask you to put yourself in Jack and my chair and ask, let me rephrase it, what question would you ask yourself?
Wow, that's a hard one always, isn't it? I think one of the things, and I tried to say this at the end of my presentation the other day, it's easy and perhaps tempting as a dean to see these opportunities and think that we can do all of them, and we can't. We all have limited resources, and I don't implement these things. I have to support them both financially and emotionally and otherwise, but there are people on my staff and people on the staff at the other organizations that are carrying the load, and they have to believe in them and be enthusiastic in them, and it can't weigh them down. So I think the question, I guess, becomes how do you decide, you know? And ultimately a lot of those decisions so far, I mean, 2 of the projects already existed, and it was a matter of they've sort of grown, and it's a little easier to say, okay, can we pull in the Haitian Law Project when we're already doing DLOC? Can we pull in the Cuban Law Project? Now this step up to the Cuban digitization is a really big step up, and we are actually hiring staff and putting significant resources into that. So we had a lot of internal conversations about who's going to do this, how is it going to get done, let's not make a commitment we can't meet, this, you know. So I think, you know, lots of opportunities come along, and trying to figure out which one is most beneficial to us, or which one can we make the greatest contribution so that we're kind of serving our role collectively in the community, that whether that's the local or regional community or nationally, that where University of Florida has a place. But it's never easy, you know, to say no to a great idea. You know, you think, oh, well, we could do this one too. And it's like, you know, trying to listen to my staff and to be realistic about, is this one worth taking on? And if so, how are we going to get the resources to do it? Because so often the people who are really good at this are the same people. And I'm sure you've all experienced that, right? I mean, that you just have some phenomenal people and they don't say no to anything either. So having a dean that doesn't good at saying no and implementers who aren't good is dangerous. So fortunately, we have a few other people who will, you know, kind of say, maybe we ought to finish this first, and I am a great believer in that. But things like DLOC, I don't think we'll ever finish. I mean, ideally it will continue to grow, but the growth is much less difficult because it's well established and well oiled and it's moving well. It would be very hard, as much as the DLOC model appeals. It would be really hard to start it all over in another geographic area, just because you'd have to start up every partnership and all of the infrastructure. And so I don't know if that's really a fair answer to your question, but.
Well, I think certainly that's an issue to be concerned about, is, you know, making sure that when you have to make a decision, you need to take all these things into consideration, resources being one of the main things.
It's always a big
and
part
it's
of it.
not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy. So.
Well, and we all have a responsibility to our primary home, you know, and so it's really easy to see when the Latin American and Caribbean collection is one of our preeminent collections, and when Latin American studies permeates almost every college and the university in some form, why DLOC would make complete sense. The depository program is maybe a little different because as a regional we were burdened by this very large depository collection. We had colleagues who were burdened by them. And so that was maybe less about the subject matter, although we've tried to pick subject matter that was relevant to the university, but more about if collectively we can reduce the burden, we can maintain our legal obligation in the program, but not have that being something that is weighing us down. Right. So different criteria by which you might judge, but...
Yeah, I think so. Judy, thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you for having me. I really
It's been
appreciate it. It's been
tremendous to
fun
chat
to
with
chat.
you, and
Yeah.